I'm proud to be an Okie from Muskogee, the place where only squares can have a ball. All right, guess who's back? Yo, Mr. Lebowski Jumper. Feeling good? How are you feeling? 5 watches. Anyway, right, let's think back to my last Talking Heads video. So I started off on the subject of, I think it was gender ideology, which I've been watching quite a lot of YouTube content on that subject. Gender ideology, and also with specific regard to trans ideology as it pertains to overall gender theory, or the two sexes. And because I've been following these two channels, one of them's called Billboard Chris, one of them's called Edge of the Matrix, and they are basically pushing back. They're essentially pushing back using their YouTube influence status, pushing back against gender theory and progressive trans ideology, which basically, as I detailed in my previous spiel, it basically states that, or asserts that, your gender, right, which is demarcated from your sex, i.e., your biological sex, which is what you're born with, your chromosomes. So it's demarcated from that. This is your gender, meaning a subjective self analysis or self classification, which is dependent not upon society's gender stereotypes or society's expectations. Like society expects 99% of nurse applications to be female, and society expects 99% of bricklayer applications to be male. So that is how we arrive at a social construct. It's to do with society's expectations of gender and behavior, right? So queer theory, progressive gender, transgender theory, it's basically taking control of your gender by saying that no, it's not. It's nothing to do with sex base and chromosomes, and it's nothing to do with society's expectations of how you should look, how you should behave, and what work you do, i.e., all of the things that denote your characteristics in society, in life, right? So your job, how you present yourself, how you talk, how you wear your hair, all these things, the whole spectrum, the whole gamut of self-identifiers. So anyway, so you can identify completely 100% subjectively, right? So it doesn't matter what anyone else thinks. Objective thinking doesn't come into it, right? That you can self identify subjectively as anything you want on the sexual spectrum. So of course, that means that, so we started off with two genders, or three. I suppose there was always a gender neutral, because that comes from people who don't want to basically put themselves in either box. Or basically, language has gender neutral as well, for a very good reason, because that's how languages are constructed, with declinations and conjugations and gender. So you always, if you've studied Latin at school, like I have, there's male, female, neutral, right? So or neuter. So anyway, yeah, amo, masamat, amati, samanti, samant, and sumus esti sunt, and blah blah blah. So there's always a gender neutral, right? So society accepts gender neutral, right? But here's the thing: when you give free rein to somebody, right, and it's usually, and I'll get onto this later, it's usually a child of 60s modern psychology or psychobabble who can, so fake doctors, people who they give doctorates to, but psychology, it's not legit science. Trust me, it's profiling. But anyway, um, so since they decided that psychology was a thing, mostly back in the 60s. This is modern psychology. I'm not talking about the founding fathers, the ancient Greeks. Um, Socrates, Plato, and all the logicians. Then the Stoics and the people that basically in the ancient world first delineated theology, i.e., religion, from logic and Stoic thinking. Because before that there was everything was based in religion. They looked up into the sky and they saw gods because they didn't have the answers, right? They didn't even know the world was round. Um, so there was, but then there was with the advent. This is before the advent of science. There was there was you know th- there was the classics. There was what's the word? I'm forgetting the word now. Not psychology. It's what was before psychology. I've gotten really brain dead because it's late. Anyway, yeah. So anyway, there's all that. But what I'm talking about is modern psychology. So basically, it's born out of Freud, Jung, um, the Russian guy. Yeah, all those Tolstoy, even people like that. Chekhov, and many others. But the movement, the modern psychology movement, which influenced the new wave of psychology in the 60s when it was designated an actual science in the West. And then suddenly it proliferates and it infiltrates all the major institutions. So now, courts, i.e., law, they determine whether or not somebody should be incarcerated in prisons if you've murdered someone or committed a bad crime, based upon what psychologists think. So profiling, it's not science. So now we decide who goes to prison based on what a psychologist would say. It doesn't matter about the evidence or how heinous the crime was. If a psychologist said they couldn't help but do it because they're mentally ill or they're not fit. We used to put these people in asylums, and we know better now, right? We have drugs, and we don't drill holes in people's brains when their brains malfunctioning. But there is a limit. There is a line in the sand where you say that, well, if somebody's if somebody's conscious of the fact they're committing a heinous crime and they do it anyway, should you be able to use the excuse that your brain doesn't work correctly to basic to basically alleviate you of culpability or liability for your acts? Should you? So that's a debate, isn't it? But anyway, back to the genders and back to the gender theories and the transgender lobby and the transgender activism. So it's basically wholly subjective. So you can go around as a bloke. You don't even need to shave your beard. You don't even need to wear a wig. You don't even need to wear women's clothes. Even if you do not present as stereotypical female as a man, you can still call yourself a trans woman and have the right to expect people to take you seriously or believe you or accept your own self identification. That's currently the world we live in. 30 years ago, that would have seemed insane, or rather, it would have seemed counterintuitive, wouldn't it? Because if you're presented with somebody like on the other side, if you're presented with a somebody who looks like a girl, all right, feminine looking, but doesn't really accentuate the feminism, the femininity, like by wearing makeup or wearing their hair really long or wearing skirts, but still you can tell they're a woman because they're feminine, more feminine looking than a man would look. So this woman who looks pretty much like a woman, so that you could tell, then says, well, actually, no, I'm not a woman. I am a man. And so they present themselves to the world as a man. And we are supposed to buy into that, accept it as a factual reality that they are not woman, they are man, based upon their own subjective identification, i.e., what they claim to feel like or want to be seen as. I'm afraid, like many of you out there, I have problems with that. I don't have problems with people living their life how you want to do it. Now, if you want to live your life, your private life, you know, and you want to do things as you feel a woman would, if you're a man, this is biological man, but you feel like a woman, right, inside. Even though, how would you feel like a woman feels inside if you're not a woman? So you'll never know what it feels like to be a woman, right? That's the logical side. But regardless of that, they feel like something different to what people have told them they are or what they genetically are. So you go around living your life pretending in your head, because that's where this is. This comes from your head, right? It's subjective self-analysis, projecting projecting inside your own mind that you are the opposite sex to what you actually biologically are. Do I have a problem with that? No, I don't have a problem with that. That's fine. You can pretend in your head, in your close unit, in your circles, who will humor you, or they'll, I don't know, they'll be kind to you, I suppose, because they care about you. You can project to those people, and you can role play and do what you want. You can identify as a Martian, a cat, a dog, a pink fluffy elephant, anything you want, right? Because it's not hurting anyone. Not really. I mean, you might be. I mean, objectively, you might be damaging your own psyche, but if you think of it from one place, if you feel like you're born in the wrong body, you've already got a damaged psyche, right? You've already got mental health problems, or you've got comorbidities that have given you mental health problems, i.e., your upbringing, how you were raised, your environment, your stimulus. All these things have somehow had an effect on your physiology and your brain chemistry, and something's gone wrong. There's a glitch in the matrix. So you're now feeling like you were, and because obviously people buy into external noise, right? So if people are saying to you outside your bubble that, oh, hang on, no, you could be born in the wrong body, as if that's an actual thing, right? Because it isn't, unless you're a spiritual fruitcake who believes in, airy fairy, non-scientific bullcrap. If you believe in the, if you believe in the zodiac and astrology, But anyway, yeah. So if it's not hurting anyone, it's not hurting anyone, right? If it makes you feel a little bit better, or you believe it makes you feel better, like a placebo would, then it's not hurting anyone. It's not hurting me, and if it's not hurting you, then that's fine with me. But herein lies the problem, and this is what I was going on about with the lobbyists. The big causes. I was referring to in America the civil rights movement, right? The 1950s and 60s. And these activists who were petitioning and marching and causing disorder on behalf of the civil rights movement, they had a pretty good point, right? Why don't people of different color, ethnic backgrounds deserve parity? Well, of course, we know that they do. We know historically they didn't, because of the winners and losers of history up to that point. So there was a status quo. Historically, there was a norm, and people are reactionary because they think that, well, we won that conflict, so therefore the norms and the status quo are here because we fought to preserve it. That doesn't mean the status quo was fair or just. So so then after the American Civil War, after all the Jim Crow and all that, they fought for the rights of black descendant black Americans. right? To have complete parity with, European descended Americans. So, I mean, America's a country almost completely made up of immigrants anyway. But the majority first generation were white Europeans who, well, basically they were Native Americans, obviously. But anyway, I won't get into that. Um, but anyway, so you have the civil rights movement, and eventually, because it was a just movement, the rest of the world, including Europe and including Great Britain, we came down on the side of the civil rights movement activists, all of them, because even though there were militant ones, very militant ones, and they would be in direct conflict with government institutions who they saw as oppressors or suppressors, people trying to suppress them from claiming what were their equal rights. So it was the same. It was the same with lots of things. Women who didn't have the right to vote. In the UK, the suffragette movement. I mean, that was quite a violent conflict at times. Um, but eventually, we realized as a society that women should have equal status to men because there's no logical argument why they shouldn't. They're not inferior to men except physically. But should that matter? Don't really think so. I mean, as soon as society evolves from, hunter gatherer kind of impulse, i.e., the jungle laws, the survival of the fittest, the those kind of things, then realistically, right, men and women are completely equal, and some are more equal than others. Always socialists, remember that. But anyway, so they fight for parity. They fight for what's just. They fight for what they believe uh, is owed to them or is due to them. And but then the problem arrives. Okay, so eventually, right, they struggle and struggle, and they gain parity. They get granted rights in law, passed into legislature, so we cannot discriminate against these groups any longer because it's illegal, right? So then what happens? What happens next? Right, okay, I'll give you some examples, right, of why behaviors, human sapient behaviors in the political arena are always they are always exhibiting similar or the very same traits, right? So okay, so for example, the gays, the lesbians, and the homosexuals, right? Um, in the early 2000s, okay, what happened in the UK after years of lobbying and protesting and engaging in media pressure and political pressure, we eventually gave way to those groups who said that even though a civil ceremony was something that a same-sex couple could engage in under law that gave you the same common law rights as that men and women have, or opposite sex partnerships. Um, the civil ceremony gave you a, a legal relationship, right? By which courts would have to recognize it. Legislature was made so this could happen. And basically, it was pretty much the same as a marriage in terms of, I don't know, when you alimony or whatever they call it, splitting up of assets when people separate, and also to do with children and or adoptive children in the case of a same-sex male relationship. So all these things have to be written into law in order that courts may act. Um, they may act accordingly and righteously when it comes to applying these laws. And and but here's the problem, that wasn't enough either. So soon it's like, well, opposite sex partners can have a marriage under law, i.e., a church ceremony, a registrar's office ceremony. We want that as well because that's only fair. Because opposite sex couples can do that. So, a few years later, and the people that resist these things because they're reactionary and they don't like. There's always reactionaries, that common common groups that are very reactionary, i.e., the slowest to react to any sort of progressive or new change or liberal changes, are the usual suspects: the church, the institutions, the police. I could go on. The reactionary organizations, the conservative organizations as well. But and the army, probably the very last organization to recognize the rights of people who do not identify as binary male or females. But anyway. So yeah, so we let the LGB, as it was called, right? The LGB community, we let them have their marriages in church if they wanted, and let's be honest, most of them, the majority, aren't particularly religious, or they don't go to church. Not really. I mean, statistics bear that out. I'm not a church goer myself. Haven't been since I was little, so So I ain't preaching, folks. Um, but 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 we let them have it. It's fine. We say fine, you can have that. But then the problem is, right now they've got parity and everything. Law says everything's equal. We can't discriminate. We can't say no. Everyone, society in general. I mean, when I say we. But then these activists, you see, they don't just disappear and float off into the ether, saying mission accomplished, job done, we're finished, the fight is over. Nope. These people don't go away. They just find new battles to fight, and they find new causes to push for and to lobby hard for. And so parity obtained. So then it kind of turns on its head. Then it becomes, okay, so now you've said all along you were wrong, and we should have had parity for all those decades we never did. In fact, if you go back far enough, go back to the 1960s and the 50s, we used to put people in prison still then for being, outed as homosexual, practicing homosexuals or lesbians, mainly the homosexuals, not so much the lesbians. But we used to put people in jail. Yeah? And was that right? No, of course it wasn't right. That's horrible, But again, that was, nearly 100 years ago. And life 100 years ago, in many respects, was pretty horrible. We had the death sentence. We used to hang people, which isn't. I don't believe that's the role of society, to take away end people's lives. I have a problem with that one. But that's my liberal upbringing coming out, I think, or maybe just my innate humanity. But anyway, yeah, I digress. But anyway, so now it's like a case of the lobbyists. They're saying, well, there was all this time where we didn't have equal rights. So now, how are you going to make us? How are you going to make that up to us? And it's across all the groups. It's not just the gender lobby. It's the LGBT, QIA, TK421, LGK4TV. I don't know, whatever the numbers are. You see it in America, because obviously in America, the Pacific slave trade didn't employ, but it engaged a lot of slaves, board and lodging. Yeah. So I wasn't making a joke about it. I used totally the wrong vocabulary there. But anyway, so there were a lot of African slaves engaged in the United States, many of whom British shipping magnates used to help ship over there. Because the Africans wanted us to, because they wanted the deals, they wanted the money, they wanted to get rid of a lot of their starving people, who they thought would probably just die anyway if they didn't ship them off to the West to work on, you know, work in the fields and in large people's rural houses. That's just the way the world was. And sure, you can blame the West for basically trafficking lives because they needed cheap workforce, uh, or you could blame the rulers of the African nations who trafficked their own people because they didn't want to be doing with them, and they didn't have jobs for them, food for them, anywhere for them to really live. So they were both self-serving entities, both sides of the Pacific slave trade and Europe. They are all self-serving entities, and the world didn't really know better in those 200 to 300 years ago, until morals evolved, the moral compass shifted, and people in the United Kingdom, what was his name, Wilberforce and others, and they shifted the moral compass, and they made people realize, and the politicians and the institutions and the monarchy, they made them realize that the slave trade was wholly amoral and a repulsive thing to be doing or engaging in, and therefore they set about repealing it and trying to eradicate it across the world. And you could argue that, yeah, well, the people who participated in it, it's rich for them to try and eradicate it, because of guilt or whatever. But the truth remains, they didn't have to. They could have just waited for somebody else to try and do it. But, they get a lot of scrutiny for that. It's like, it's always the white person's fault. The rulers of Africa, they never get any blame. They're totally absolved of any blame because they're the same skin color as the people who were being exploited. Yeah, and in some cases killed. But, let's face it, their chances of survival were pretty limited anyway in their own country. And that's just a fact. But anyway, let's forget about that. Let's go back to the fact that after the American Civil Rights Movement, these people gained parity, right? There was an end to Jim Crow, all of this. But now, okay, what do they want? So the advent then, fast forward a few more decades to the 80s, and then we have what's known as litigation culture. Now, litigation culture is born of a lot of things, right? And one of them is runaway free market capitalism. Now, I'm a proponent of free market capitalism, yeah, but it does need some controls. But one of the reasons you get runaway free market capitalism, because it infiltrates strata by strata into the legal system, into the courts, and then the next thing you know it, you can sue another entity, another organization, another company, another individual. You can sue them for whatever amount you think is feasible to a judge. A judge will say, "Oh, okay, then you can ask for that." Right? You can sue them for whatever amount you want. And in some cases, those judges will side with your claim, the petitioner against or the claimant against the defendant, right? This is litigation culture is civil. Some cases, a judge will agree with your cause, or they agree to your righteous indignation and insistence that you are owed this money, and they will use the court system to apply it. So therefore, it becomes a legal ruling, and that's how litigation culture is born. And then, of course, you get people counterclaims, and they are given sometimes. So therefore, you get two-sided litigation culture. So now you have the proliferation of litigation culture, and this also explains a lot of things in the medical science and the medical industrial complex, basically pharma complex. So basically, litigation culture that was rife or proliferating massively in terms of fiscal value in America. So therefore, the pharmaceuticals and the medicals, they had to create safeguards. But I'll go into that. I'll talk about that in another video, right? Because it's not really relevant. But I mean, litigation culture has a lot to blame for. And one of those things, of course, is the lobby groups that are asking for reparations for slavery. Now, this is what you're talking about is slavery that affected 4 to 5 generations ago, like 250 years, roughly. Now, that's a long time, 250 years. But the descendants of the descendants of the descendants of these people who may have been subject to slavery ownership in the United States. Many of whom were owned by the black people. Let's not forget that, or people of color. They weren't all owned by white landowners. In fact, some of the very first slaves that were shipped into the Americas were done so by non-white Americans. That's a fact as well. Go and research that one. But don't use Wikipedia because Wikipedia is selective truths and controlled by left-wing sort of Democrat funders. Anyway, so now lobby groups, they want reparations, and it's the same with the transgender lobby. Now it's not enough to have parity. You see, I used to feel a great amount of sympathy for persecuted sexual minorities. But now you see, they want their cake, and they've got their cake. Now they want to eat it, and they want to eat your cake and my cake. Not figuratively, right? So now they want us to recognize 20 genders, 50 genders, 75 genders, 109 genders. I lose count of the last one. Many of which are just plainly laughable. They're ridiculous. They bear no relevance to objective reality. They are the manifestations of people's, mentally deluded people's fetishes, right? Let's call them what they are. They're not genders. They're the definition, the Webster's definition of gender has not changed significantly in the last 20 years. But people who belong to, queer theory, gender lobbies, progressive left-wing associations, they have hijacked the term gender and infused it with psychobabble and subjective mental projection and basically nothing that's grounded in reality. I'm not even going to begin to go into the amount of strange words, strange descriptions, and nonsensical fetishes. So niche, you might only have one person who's ever admitted to actually being an adherent of that fetish. Now that's what comprises the 109 listed genders that are presented to us as a serious matter for our indulgence, right? And they want to pass laws to make it legal. They're still looking to pass more laws. They've got equality for non-heterosexuals, but now they want us to bend over backwards, take it up the jacksie, and they want to shove all their psychobabble nonsense onto our lives and make our lives a misery if we object to it. So basically what you're talking about is you're not talking about parity anymore because they've achieved parity. What you're talking about now is dominance and revenge. Dominance and revenge. That's what happens when you give minority groups legal parity, legal rights, and legal overindulgence. They want to dominate you and they want revenge. It's the world we live in, folks. More coming.